The scrap of paper in Seth Maddox's breast pocket had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft, the ink slightly blurred at the edges, but the name written on it remained perfectly legible: Sallie Conley, Dusty Creek, Texas. And for 600 miles of hard riding across New Mexico territory, that name had been the only thing he needed to know. It was the spring of 1878, and Seth Maddox was 26 years old, sunburned down to the bone, carrying a leather saddlebag that held everything he owned, and riding a buckskin mare named Duchess who had more sense than he did on most days. He had left Abilene with $40, a good rifle, and the recommendation of a matchmaker named Mrs. Hetty Pruitt, who ran her correspondence service out of a dry goods store and claimed she had never made a bad match in 11 years of business. Seth had not been looking for a bride exactly. He had been looking for a reason to stop drifting, and those two things had turned out to be close enough to the same. The advertisement he had answered, written in Mrs. Pruitt's neat hand on behalf of her client, had described a capable woman of 23 years, recently widowed, who owned a modest property in Dusty Creek and required a man of steady character to help work the land and build something lasting. Seth had read that advertisement 4 times, standing in the general store in Abilene with a cup of cooling coffee in his hand, and something in it had reached into his chest and taken hold. He was not a man who put stock in fate or signs, but he had written the letter that same afternoon. 2 months of correspondence had followed, careful, formal letters that grew gradually less careful and less formal as the weeks passed. He had told her about his years working cattle drives up from San Antonio, about the way he had watched other men build lives in the places he passed through while he kept moving, about the small farm in Missouri where he had grown up before his parents died of fever when he was 16. She had told him about her late husband, a man named Roy Conley who had died of a rattlesnake bite 8 months prior, leaving her with 80 acres of decent grazing land, a half-finished house, and no family closer than a cousin in Louisiana she had never met. She had written plainly and without self-pity, and Seth had respected that enormously. By the time Mrs. Pruitt facilitated the formal agreement, Seth had already made up his mind. He sold his saddle horse, bought Duchess instead because she had broader shoulders and more endurance, replenished his supplies, and rode south and west with the name Sallie Conley burning in his pocket like a coal. He crossed into Texas on a Wednesday morning when the sky was the deep clear blue that only exists before the heat rises, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time, which was anticipation. He had a direction, a name, and a purpose. That was more than he'd had in years. He reached Dusty Creek by midday on Thursday, which was a small town that had grown up around a water source that had gone increasingly dry over the past decade, leaving the town's name as an ironic reminder of its origins. There was a main street with a saloon, a livery stable, a general store, a small church, and a scattering of other establishments. The population was perhaps 300 souls, and strangers were noticed immediately. Seth tied Duchess at the post outside the general store and pushed through the door, hat in hand. A man of about 50 stood behind the counter with the permanently suspicious expression of someone who had seen enough strangers come through to trust none of them. "Looking for the Conley property," Seth said. "I was told it's east of town, about 4 miles. The storekeeper looked him over very thoroughly. "You'd be the man from Abilene." "Seth Maddox." "Yes, sir." "Word travels," the man said, neither warmly nor coldly. He was simply a man who stated facts. "Turn east on the main road, follow it till you see the old cottonwood that got struck by lightning. Turn south there. Half-mile down you'll see the property. Can't miss the windmill, it's been half broken for 2 months." Seth thanked him and left. He remounted Duchess and took the east road, and the town fell behind him within minutes, replaced by the flat and enormous landscape of West Texas in late spring mesquite scrub, prickly pear, the distant suggestion of hills to the southwest, and overhead the kind of sky that made a person feel both insignificant and inexplicably alive. He found the lightning-struck cottonwood and turned south, and within a few minutes he saw the property. And the storekeeper had been right that you couldn't miss the windmill because it was canting at a painful angle, one of its blades broken and dangling like a loose tooth. Beyond the windmill was the house, which was a low structure of rough-cut timber, an adobe that someone had clearly been working to expand, because there was a partly framed addition on the south side with new lumber beginning to gray in the sun. There was a small barn, a corral with 3 horses in it, and beyond that, fields showing the early green of a winter wheat crop that was coming in well. Seth dismounted at the gate, a simple rail gate set in a low fence, and led Duchess through and up the short path toward the house. He was halfway there when the front door opened and a woman stepped out onto the narrow porch, and everything Seth had expected, which was not much and nothing specific, rearranged itself completely. Sallie Conley was not what he had pictured. He was not sure what he had pictured, exactly something assembled from the careful formal language of her letters. Perhaps, but whatever vague image had been living in the back of his mind, dissolved the moment he saw her, and was replaced entirely by the real thing. She was tall for a woman, perhaps 5'7", with dark red hair that had been pinned up but was losing the argument with the wind, coming loose in thick strands around a face that was angular and direct and sunburned across the nose and cheekbones. She was wearing a plain brown working dress and leather boots that had clearly seen serious use, and she had one hand resting on the porch post and was watching him approach with an expression he could not read, which was not hostility and not warmth, but something in between the expression of a person who had decided to reserve judgment. She was also, and he felt the observation arrive with the force of something he had not been prepared for, extraordinarily beautiful in the way that has nothing to do with softness or prettiness but everything to do with the quality of the attention in someone's eyes, which in her case was considerable. "Mr. Maddox," she said when he reached the porch steps. "Miss Conley," he said, then corrected himself. "Mrs. Conley, I apologize." Something moved across her face. "Sallie is fine," she said. "You made good time." Road was clear most of the way. He realized he was holding his hat in both hands and doing something useless with the brim. "It's a good property," he said, looking out at the fields because he needed to look somewhere other than her face for a moment. "Wheat's coming in well." "It is," she said. "I've been managing it alone since October. It's been manageable mostly." There was a pause, and he heard in it the particular exhaustion of a person who had been doing the work of 2 people for 8 months without complaint. "Come inside. I have coffee on." He tied Duchess at the post by the porch and followed Sallie into the house, ducking slightly under the low doorframe, and found himself in a single main room that served as kitchen, sitting area, and what passed for a parlor, with 2 doors on the far wall leading presumably to sleeping quarters. The room was clean and spare and functional, with a cast-iron stove, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books, and a window facing west that let in the afternoon light in long amber bars. Sallie poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove and set them on the table and sat down in one chair, and Seth sat in the other, and they looked at each other across the table with the specific awkwardness of 2 people who have said quite a lot in letters and now have to figure out how to be actual people in each other's presence. "You're younger than I expected," she said. He stopped. "I'm what?" "You're not what I expected either," he said carefully. "That's not a complaint." She looked at him for a long moment with those direct gray eyes of hers. "Mrs. Pruitt's advertisement made me sound like a farm listing," she said. "Capable woman, modest property. Like something you'd find in a land sale notice." "It's what made me write," Seth said. "I don't mean that badly. I mean it was honest. I appreciated honest." Something in her expression shifted slightly, becoming less guarded. "You said in your letters that you've been on cattle drives since you were 17. Until 2 years ago. Then I did some ranch work in New Mexico territory, some work as a deputy in a town called Morales for about 6 months. Nothing that stuck." "Why didn't it stick?" She asked, and there was genuine curiosity in the question, not challenge. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. I kept thinking there was somewhere else I was supposed to be, he said. I kept moving trying to find it. He paused. I stopped being sure that was true about a year ago. That's when I answered your advertisement. Sallie was quiet for a moment. My husband Roy was a good man, she said. He wasn't, she stopped. He was kind and hardworking, and he died from a snake bite because he was too proud to call for help until it was too late. I grieved him properly. I want you to know that. But I also could not keep this land alone forever, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. That's honest, Seth said. I try to be, she said. I want to be clear about what this arrangement is. Mrs. Prout drew up papers. You work the land, you have rights to a portion of the crop and the income from it, and the arrangement can go further from there or not, depending on how things go. I won't be rushed into anything, and I won't be. She stopped again, and he saw her gather herself. I've had to be very careful about being alone out here. There are men who see a widow alone and decide that means something about what they can do. So I need you to understand that I'm not Mrs. Conley, Seth said, and then remembered. Sallie. I understand. I'm not here to make anything harder for you. I came because I want to do honest work and build something real. Whatever else might come from it, that's on whatever timetable you decide. You have my word on that. She studied him for a long moment, and whatever she was looking for in his face, she seemed to find enough of it because some of the tension went out of her shoulders. There's a small room in the barn, she said. It's clean. There's a cot and a trunk and a lantern. It'll do until we get the addition framed up. Roy started it last summer. I saw it when I rode in. I can work on that. There's plenty to work on, she said, and for the first time, the faintest edge of a smile crossed her face. The windmill alone is going to take a week. Seth looked at her and felt something he could not immediately name, which was later, on reflection, simply the sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not know what to do with that feeling, and he was fairly certain he was not going to leave. He spent the first 3 days on the windmill. It was meticulous, frustrating work. The windmill was a Halliday standard pattern, approximately 30 feet tall, and getting up to the broken blade required a combination of climbing and rigging that left his arms aching at the end of each day. The blade itself had cracked through in a winter wind and needed to be replaced entirely, and the replacement timber had to be cut and shaped by hand because there was nothing in Dusty Creek that sold windmill parts without a 2-week order. He improvised, which was a skill that years of cattle driving had developed in him to a considerable degree. Sallie brought him water and a midday meal each day without being asked, setting them down at the base of the windmill and not lingering, always returning to whatever work she was doing in the house or the fields. She was perpetually busy in the way of someone who has organized their time around necessity rather than preference, feeding the horses at first light, tending the kitchen garden before the heat rose, checking the wheat, mending fences, repairing the leather harness on the plow, cooking, preserving, and at the end of each day reading for an hour in the amber light from the west window before the lantern was lit. Seth watched her the way you watch someone you're trying to understand, which is carefully and mostly without them noticing. On the 4th morning, he came out of the barn at dawn to find her already in the wheat field, moving along the rows with a hoe in a way that told him she had been at it for some time. He saddled Duchess, rode out to the field, dismounted, and picked up the second hoe leaning against the fence post and joined her. She glanced at him sideways. The windmill? Done. Tested it last night. Works fine. Something passed through her expression that was difficult to name but felt a great deal like relief, deeply held and carefully not expressed. Good, she said. The water table here is 12 feet down. We need that windmill to keep the trough filled. They worked the field together for 2 hours without much conversation, and Seth found that the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have a specific task and are focused on it, and there was something easeful in that, a kind of companionship he had not expected to find so quickly. By the time the sun was fully up and the heat was building, they had covered a significant portion of the field, and when Sallie straightened and pressed her hand into the small of her back, Seth saw in the tight lines around her mouth that the work cost her more than she let on. "I can finish this today," he said, "if you have other things." "I need to go into town," she said. "I need flour and lamp oil, and I need to speak with a man named Harlan Greer about a disputed fence line on the north boundary." A shadow crossed her face when she said Harlan Greer's name. "Who is Harlan Greer?" "He owns the property north of mine," Sallie said, in a tone that conveyed considerable information without containing many words. He's been insisting for 6 months that the fence line runs 20 feet further south than the original survey shows, which would give him access to my north well. He tried to buy this property from me twice in the past year. Both times I refused." Seth set the hoe against his leg and looked at her. "He's been trouble. He's been persistent," she said carefully. "He's well regarded in town. He's a friend of the county judge, so I have to manage it carefully." This was delivered with the precise economy of someone describing a dangerous situation while making every effort not to sound frightened, and Seth recognized it with the certainty of someone who had been a deputy long enough to know the shape of it. "You want me to come with you?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I can handle my own business." "I know that," he said. "I'm offering to come as someone who works this property, not as anything else." There was a pause. The wind moved through the wheat around them. A meadowlark called somewhere to the east. "All right," she said finally. "I leave in an hour." Dusty Creek was livelier in the morning than it had been when Seth rode through it 2 days prior, and he noticed the way people looked at Sallie with a mixture of respect and a certain wariness, and the way she moved through it with her head straight and her shoulders set, acknowledging greetings with brief nods and moving with purpose. She left him at the general store to attend to her supply order while she went to find Harlan Greer, and Seth purchased 2 items he needed for the barn repair, and then stepped out onto the boardwalk to wait, and was standing there when he saw her come out of the land office 100 yards down the street. She was walking fast and her face was closed and tight, and behind her, in the doorway of the land office, stood a man of perhaps 55 who was watching her go with an expression that Seth liked the look of not at all. Harlan Greer was a large man, broad through the chest, running to softness now but clearly powerful beneath it, with a face that had the particular set of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and found present circumstances an annoying inconvenience. Their eyes met across the distance of the street, and Greer looked at Seth the way a man measures another man, and Seth looked back with the same flat attention he had learned to use as a deputy in morals, which conveyed nothing useful to the person on the receiving end, except that the man looking at them was entirely unimpressed. Sallie reached him and they collected her supplies and loaded them onto the pack horse she had brought from the property, and as they rode out of town Seth said, "How did it go?" "He showed me a document he says is a corrected survey from 1876, she said. "I told him I had the original survey from 1872 and that the county surveyor's office would have the same record. He said the 1876 survey superseded it." She paused. "I don't believe there is a 1876 survey. I think he had something drawn up. Do you have a lawyer?" "There is one lawyer in Dusty Creek and he works mostly for Harlan Greer's interests," she said. "What about the county seat?" "San Felipe, 40 miles. She was quiet for a moment. "Roy was dealing with this before he died. He wrote to the county surveyor's office, but they hadn't responded yet. I wrote again in January, still nothing." Seth rode beside her and thought about this. "I'll ride to San Felipe next week," he said. "I can go to the surveyor's office myself, get the record in writing." She looked at him. "That's a 2-day round trip. The field will survive without me for 2 days. You don't have to." "Sallie," he said, and then stopped because it was the first time he had used her name in speech, and it landed in the air between them with a weight he had not anticipated, and she felt it too, he could tell, because something briefly uncertain moved through her expression. "I work this property," he continued. That means the fence line matters to me too. She looked forward at the road for a moment, then back at him. All right, she said. I'd appreciate that. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt, to Seth, increasingly natural. Not in the sense that it was easy, because there was nothing easy about the work, but in the sense that it fit. He rose before dawn, began whatever structural task was most pressing, broke to eat whatever Sallie had left out before she went to the fields, worked until midday, ate the meal she brought to wherever he was working, and spent the afternoon either in the fields or at the barn or on the addition, which was beginning to take real shape now, the framing going up clean and square. In the evenings they ate together at the kitchen table. This had happened the first night without discussion, Sallie simply setting 2 plates instead of 1 when Seth came in from washing up at the pump, and he had sat down without comment and they had eaten together, and it had continued every night since. The conversation at dinner was what changed things, or began to. They talked about the work, the state of the wheat, the horses, the progress on the addition, but they also gradually began to talk about other things. Sallie talked about growing up in Tennessee, the daughter of a schoolteacher, and how she had come west at 18 with her late husband who had been 20 and full of certainty that Texas was going to make them rich. It didn't make us rich, she said, with the tone of someone who had long since made peace with that, but it was ours. Seth talked about the cattle drives, the particular beauty of the Kishom Trail in early morning before the heat, the way a herd of 3,000 longhorns sounded moving across flat ground, the men he had worked with, some of whom he still thought about. He talked about the time he had spent as a deputy in morals, and one of those stories made her laugh, a genuine laugh, not a polite one, full and unguarded, and he felt the sound of it land somewhere in the center of his chest and stay there. She had opinions about everything, delivered with a directness that occasionally startled him and never stopped being interesting. She had read widely. The shelf of books was not decorative, and she could hold a conversation about history and politics, and the state of the territories with the same precision she applied to crop rotation. She was also, he discovered, stubbornly proud in a way that made her occasionally refuse help she needed, which he navigated by simply doing the thing without asking and waiting for her to decide how to feel about it. After the first week, she stopped looking at him as if she was measuring him for a threat. After 2 weeks, she had begun to occasionally initiate conversation that had nothing to do with the work, asking him questions about places he had been, what he had seen, what he had made of it. He answered carefully and honestly, and sometimes she would look at him while he talked with an expression he did not entirely trust himself to interpret. He rode to San Felipe on a Monday, and returned on Tuesday evening with a certified copy of the 1872 land survey, which showed the boundary line exactly where Sallie had said it was, and a written statement from the county surveyor's office confirming there was no corrected survey on record from any subsequent date. He had also, on an impulse he did not examine too closely, stopped at a small shop in San Felipe and purchased a small book of poems by Walt Whitman that he had noticed in the window, because she had mentioned liking Whitman in a letter, and he had not forgotten. He set the certified documents and the book on the kitchen table when he came in that evening, and Sallie looked at them, looked at him, and picked up the book first. She turned it over in her hands and opened to the title page, and something happened in her face that was very soft and very brief and then was gone. "You remembered that," she said. "You mentioned it in March," he said. "Third letter." She looked at him across the table, and the evening light was coming through the west window and falling across her face, and she said, "Thank you, Seth." And it was the first time she had used his given name, and the effect of it on him was something he was not going to examine in any detail right now. "The documents should settle the fence line," he said. "You'll want to write to Greer formally and send a copy to the county judge." "I will," she said. She was still holding the book. "Did you eat in San Felipe?" "I had something at the road house." "Sit down," she said, already moving to the stove. "I have beans and cornbread." He sat down and watched her move around the kitchen and thought, not for the first time, that he was in a significant amount of trouble with regard to his own feelings, and that this was going to require careful management. The spring turned toward summer. The wheat crop came to harvest in June, and Seth hired 2 men from town to help bring it in over the course of a week, Mexican laborers named Tomás and Ernesto, who worked hard and expected fair pay, which Seth ensured they received in full, and both men thanked Sallie directly at the end of the week, which told him something about the reputation she had built among people who worked for fair wages as opposed to those who didn't. The harvest was better than Seth had expected, given the half-broken windmill and the months Sallie had managed alone. They loaded the grain onto the wagon and Seth drove it to the grain buyer in Dusty Creek, and when he came back with the payment, Sallie counted the money at the kitchen table with a look of quiet, contained relief. "This covers the property tax through next year," she said, "and there's enough left over for seed and the materials we need for the addition." She looked up. "And your share?" "We can talk about my share later." "No," she said, with that particular firmness that he had learned was non-negotiable. "We agreed on terms. I keep my word." He accepted his portion and said nothing more about it. The summer brought heat that was absolute and unrelenting, the kind of heat that West Texas produces in July and August that makes the air above the ground shimmer and turns every hour of outdoor work into an exercise in endurance. Seth was accustomed to working in heat, and so was Sallie, but they adjusted their schedule, rising earlier and doing the hardest labor in the first hours of the morning and the last hours before dark, resting through the peak of the afternoon. It was during one of these afternoon rests, sitting on the porch in whatever shade the overhang provided, that their conversations became something else entirely. He had been reading, she had lent him a book from her shelf, a history of the Western Territories, which was considerably better written than he had expected, and she had been mending a shirt, and at some point she had put the mending down and was looking out at the shimmering distance and said, without preamble, "Do you miss it?" "Miss what?" "Moving. The cattle drives, going somewhere different." He considered the question honestly, which she deserved. "I thought I would," he said, "when I first arrived. I thought after a few weeks I'd start feeling the itch." He paused. "I don't." She looked at him then. "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Because this place means something, and I think I've been wanting to be somewhere that means something for a long time." She held his gaze for a moment that lasted long enough to feel significant and then looked back at the distance. "Roy used to say the land was what mattered," she said. "I didn't understand that fully until after he died. I nearly sold it, the week after I buried him. There was a part of me that thought, this is too much, this is too hard, I should go back to Tennessee." She paused. "And then one morning I came out at dawn and the light it was like fire across the mesquite, and I thought, no, this is mine. I built this. I'm not leaving it." "You didn't leave it," Seth said. "No," she said. "I didn't." A pause. "I'm glad you wrote that letter." The words were simple and direct in the way she was always simple and direct, and they hit him with the force of something considerably more elaborate. "So am I," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. She picked up her mending. He went back to his book, but the afternoon had shifted into something new, and neither of them pretended it hadn't. In August, Harlan Greer made his move. Seth had ridden out to check the north fence line that morning, a routine he had established since the dispute began, and found that someone had removed 3 posts from the fence and moved the line approximately 20 feet south in the night, running a new wire and staking it hastily. The old posts had been pulled and thrown into the mesquite. It was a crude and brazen act, the kind that expected either not to be noticed or not to be challenged. Seth looked at it for a long moment, controlling his temper with the specific patience he had learned in morals, and then rode back to the house. Sallie listened to his report with her hands flat on the kitchen table and her face very still. Then she said, "That's trespassing and property destruction." "It is," Seth said. "We need to document it before we touch it. Then we need to go to the county sheriff." "The county sheriff and Harlan Greer hunt together," she said. "He may," Seth said. But if we have a certified survey, witness testimony, and physical evidence, there's a limit to how much he can ignore it without becoming complicit in something that's a criminal matter, not a civil one." She looked at him with an expression that was evaluating and not entirely hopeful. "You sound like a deputy." "I was one for 6 months," he said. "And I know that men like Greer count on women alone to be too afraid or too tired to push back through proper channels. So we push back through proper channels, and we do it loudly enough that there are witnesses." They rode to town together that afternoon. Seth had written a clear account of what he had found, with measurements and the location of the removed posts, and Sallie brought the certified survey copy. They went to the sheriff's office, which was occupied by a man named Walt Bridges, who had the look of someone who had been doing a comfortable job for a long time and was not enthusiastic about having it complicated. He listened with the expression of a man counting the seconds until an inconvenience passes. "I'll look into it," he said, which Seth recognized as the sound of a man intending to do nothing. "Sheriff Bridges," Seth said, setting both hands on the desk and keeping his voice even. "I worked deputy law and morals for 6 months under Sheriff Dale Eckert. I know what investigating a property crime requires. I have written documentation, a certified survey from the county office, and I can produce 2 men who can attest to the fence line's prior position. If this proceeds to the county judge without a prior sheriff's investigation, I want it on record that we came to you first." Bridges looked at him with somewhat less comfort than he had a moment ago. "I said I'll look into it." "I appreciate that," Seth said. "We'll be in town for the next hour, in case you want to take a preliminary statement." He and Sallie went to the general store, and the storekeeper, whose name turned out to be Edmund Fay, listened to a brief account of the situation with the sympathetic attention of a man who had his own concerns about Harlan Greer's business practices. By the time they left, 3 other people in the store had heard enough to understand the shape of things, and Seth knew that in a town of 300, that was as good as a public notice. Sheriff Bridges came by the store before they left and took a written statement. He did it without grace or enthusiasm, but he did it, and Seth thanked him politely. On the ride back, Sallie said, "You played that well. Men like Greer work in private," Seth said. "The best counter to that is making things public." She was quiet for a moment. "You weren't frightened of him?" "Not especially. Most people are. He's powerful in this county." "He's powerful as long as people are frightened," Seth said. "The moment he's being watched and documented, he's just a man who moved some fence posts." He paused. "How are you feeling?" She considered this. "Angry," she said, "but less afraid than I was this morning." She glanced at him sideways. "Thank you. It's my fence line too," he said, and she smiled at that. One of those rare full smiles that changed her face entirely, and he made himself look back at the road. The fence was restored. Greer did not make another direct move against the property, though Seth was fairly certain he did not entirely let go of his ambitions. Men like that rarely did. But the public nature of what had happened, combined with the documented evidence, created enough of a burden of proof that pursuing the matter further became more trouble than the 20 feet of ground was worth. The addition to the house was finished by September. Seth had worked on it whenever other tasks allowed, and the result was a proper second room with a real floor and a window facing the morning sun, and a door that fit square in its frame. He had built the furniture himself, a bed frame, a small table, a washstand with wood from the San Felipe lumber order, planed and fitted with the care of someone who builds things to last. Sallie came in to look at it on the afternoon it was completed, running her hand along the window frame and then the bed frame, and turning around slowly to take in the whole room. "You do good work," she said. "My father was a carpenter before he was a farmer," Seth said. "He taught me." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Seth," in a tone that made him stand still. He turned from where he had been looking at the window fitting to find her looking at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded, which was rare enough to be alarming. She had put down every guard she had been carrying since he arrived, and the openness of her face was something he didn't quite know how to respond to. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right. I had a plan when I wrote to Mrs. Prout," she said. "It was a practical plan. I needed help with the land, and I needed someone who would honor an agreement and work honestly. That was what I was looking for." She paused, and her jaw set briefly in the way it did when she was working to say something difficult. "I was not looking for someone I would. I didn't plan on things going the way they have." Seth's heart was making itself known in a way he could not entirely manage. "How have they gone?" he asked, carefully. She looked at him with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "You know how," she said. He crossed the room to where she was standing and stopped close enough that she would have to decide how she felt about proximity, which was something he had been careful about since he arrived, and she did not step back. She looked up at him with the direct, unwavering attention that was simply the way she engaged with everything. "I've been trying to be careful," he said. "I didn't want to be one more thing you had to manage." "You haven't been," she said. "That's the problem. You've been the opposite of that." A pause. "I think about you when you're not in the room. I've never said that to anyone." He reached up and tucked back one of the strands of her dark red hair that the wind had stolen, and she stayed very still beneath the touch. "I came 600 miles for a name on a piece of paper," he said, "and I would have ridden 6,000. She put her hand against his chest then, palm flat over his heartbeat, and he covered it with his own hand. "Don't leave," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "That's what I'm trying to say. Don't leave." "Sallie," he said. "I have not the slightest idea how to leave." She kissed him then, or he kissed her. The direction of it was ambiguous and didn't matter, because it was mutual in every sense, and it was the kind of first kiss that arrives after a significant amount of something building toward it, which means it is less a beginning than an acknowledgement. When they separated, she looked at him with a slight color in her sun-browned cheeks and said, with something that was almost humor, "I think the practical arrangement may need to be renegotiated." "I think so too," Seth said. They were married in the Dusty Creek Church on the 14th of October, 1878, which was a bright, cool autumn morning, the kind of morning that makes West Texas briefly resemble a different kind of country entirely, soft and golden and forgiving. There were perhaps 40 people in attendance, the neighbors who were decent, people from town who had come to have an opinion about Seth Maddox over the past 5 months, Edmund Fay, the storekeeper, who had thawed considerably and had sent a genuine wedding gift of a good copper pot, and Tomás and Ernesto, who arrived with their wives and sat in the front pew with expressions of pleased satisfaction, as though they had been watching this particular conclusion approach for some time. Sallie wore a dark green dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from San Felipe, and her hair was pinned up with unusual success. And when Seth saw her come through the church door, he took a breath and held it, because she was, simply and completely, the most remarkable person he had ever met, and he was keenly aware that she had chosen him. The ceremony was brief and plain and exactly right. The minister, a young man of about 30 named Reverend Cole, who had the manner of someone still learning to be solemn, read the words, and they said the words back, and Seth put a ring on her finger that he had made in San Felipe from silver, not gold, because there was no gold available, and he would not give her something inferior made to look like something it wasn't, and her hand was warm and steady in his. Afterward, there was a small celebration in the churchyard with food that the women of the town had contributed, and someone produced a fiddle, and the afternoon went long in the warm October light, with children running between the adults' legs and the smell of wood smoke beginning to come in from the distance as the sun went lower. Sallie danced with him once at his request, and she was better at it than he expected, and said so. "I grew up in Tennessee," she said. "We danced at everything. Weddings, funerals, harvests. My mother said dancing was proof that people could make good things despite everything." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Seth said. "She was," Sallie said, and he heard the past tense and understood and held her slightly closer without making a point of it, and she let him. They rode home in the late afternoon, the two of them side by side in the wagon, and the property looked different to Seth as they came toward it, though nothing physical had changed. The windmill was turning steadily in the evening breeze. The wheat fields were bare and turned for winter. The barn was solid and the fences were properly set. The house, with its new addition, sat low and solid against the sky. "Home," Sallie said beside him. "Home," Seth agreed. That winter was the first one Seth had spent in one place since he was 16 years old. He had expected to find it confining in some way, the particular restlessness that had driven him from place to place for 10 years asserting itself in the settled quiet of winter. It did not. The days were full and the evenings were long, and the house was warm with the cast iron stove going, and Sallie was there reading, or knitting, or talking, or sitting in the lamplight, with a particular quality of presence that made every room she was in feel inhabited in the best sense of the word. They talked more deeply that winter than they had in the summer and fall, in the way that winter enforces depth because it removes the option of busyness. He told her things he had not told anyone about the years after his parents died, moving between relatives who had taken him in without enthusiasm, the particular loneliness of knowing you were a burden and having no alternative to it, the way he had turned toward the open road at 17 with the specific relief of someone leaving a place that had never quite been theirs. She listened without interrupting and without pity, which was what he needed. She told him things in return. About the early years of her marriage to Roy, which had been difficult in ways she had not been prepared for, not unkind, but hard, because building from nothing in a new place with two young people who were both too proud to admit they didn't know what they were doing is hard, and she had been very young and very far from everything familiar. "I grew up in it," she said. "I grew up faster than I wanted to, but I grew up into something I'm glad to be." "I can see that in you," Seth said. She looked at him. "What do you see?" "Someone who decided who they were going to be and went ahead and became that person," he said, without waiting for permission. She was quiet for a moment. "That's about the best thing anyone has ever said to me," she said, and her voice was low and warm, and he reached across the table and took her hand and she turned hers over to hold his back. In February, Sallie told Seth she was pregnant. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly and directly, in the way she did everything, but he saw beneath the matter-of-factness the thing she was not saying, which was that she was both deeply glad and aware that being glad was a form of vulnerability she was still learning to allow herself. He sat down on the edge of the table and looked at her, and felt something move through him that was too large for his chest. "How long have you known?" he asked. "About 2 weeks," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." "How are you feeling?" "Fine," she said. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise fine." She paused. "Are you?" She stopped. "Are you glad?" He crossed the kitchen floor in 2 steps and put both hands on her face and looked at her. "Sallie," he said, "I am so glad I can barely stand it." She put her hands over his and her eyes were bright, and she did not let any tears fall because that was Sallie, but he could see it was a close thing. And he kissed her forehead, and then held her for a long while in the morning kitchen with the stove going, and the February light coming gray and clean through the west window. The pregnancy progressed well through the spring. Sallie worked as she always worked, with modifications Seth increasingly insisted upon, and she increasingly accepted, which was its own form of progress in their relationship. Her learning that accepting help was not a surrender of anything that mattered. He took over the heaviest of the field work without discussion, and she did not argue after the first 2 attempts, and instead redirected her considerable energy into expanding the kitchen garden and undertaking the reorganization of the barn that she had apparently been planning for 2 years. Their neighbor to the east, a woman named Clara Hutchins, whose husband Jim worked the adjacent property, had become Sallie's closest friend over the winter. Clara was a broad, warm, practical woman of about 35 who had 4 children of her own and greeted Sallie's news with an enthusiasm that temporarily overwhelmed even Sallie's composure. She came by regularly through the spring and summer, and Seth came to appreciate her presence both because it made Sallie happy, and because Clara had the quality of someone whose friendship was uncomplicated and genuine in a way that he found increasingly rare. Jim Hutchins came by for a different kind of visit in May, sitting on the porch with Seth in the evenings occasionally, talking cattle and crops and the general state of the county in the way that neighboring men do. And Seth found in him a straightforward companionship that he welcomed. Jim had come west from Ohio and had the slightly astounded quality of a man who had discovered he loved the Texas plain despite having had no prior evidence that he would. "You settling in all right?" Jim asked him one evening in May when the last light was long and red across the mesquite. "Better than I expected," Seth said. "Sally's good people," Jim said. "Had a hard time of it before. Glad she's not alone out here anymore." "So am I," Seth said. Harlan Greer died in June of 1879, of a heart attack in the saloon of all places, which was neither a violent nor a dignified end, but was a definitive one. The news came to the property via Clara Hutchins, who delivered it with the particular neutral expression of a woman reporting a fact that she is aware one should not actively celebrate. The fence line dispute died with him, as there was no one who cared to pursue it among his successors, and Seth quietly replaced the 3 fence posts with better ones and left the matter settled. Sallie heard the news and was quiet for a moment and then said, "I want to feel charitable about it." "You don't have to," Seth said. "No," she said, "I don't." She paused. "I just feel relief mostly, which is honest." "It's honest," he agreed. Their son was born on the 12th of July, 1879, which was a mercilessly hot day but a clear one, with a remarkable sunset that Seth watched from the porch, while the midwife Clara and Sally's church friend Mrs. Agnes Dodd were inside doing the important work, and he was outside doing the considerably less useful work of pacing. Clara came to the door at sundown and said, "You can come in now," with an expression of uncomplicated joy, and Seth went in to find Sallie sitting up in the bed in the new room with her hair dark with sweat and her face exhausted and luminous, and his son in her arms. They named him William, after Seth's father, with Roy as a middle name, because Sallie had asked and Seth had said yes immediately. William Maddox was a healthy and vocal infant who made his opinions known with a clarity that Seth suspected he had inherited from his mother. He was fair-haired, which surprised them both, and had Sally's gray eyes and Seth's build even at a day old, that compact solidity that his grandmother would have called sturdy. Sallie nursed him with the same competence and slight bewilderment she applied to any entirely new skill, and Seth held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the new room and felt something shift permanently in the architecture of himself. "Hello, William," he said very quietly. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused intensity of the newly born, which felt startlingly like attention. Sallie watched from the bed. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your eyes. Those could go either way yet." She was quiet for a moment. "Seth, are you happy?" He looked at her over the head of their son. "Sallie," he said, "I have never in my life been this happy." Her smile in the lamplight was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The autumn that William turned 2 months old was the fullest and most alive of any Seth could remember. The second wheat crop had come in well again. The addition to the house had been extended with another small room for the baby, and the property had begun to develop the accumulated character of a place that was being cared for with intention over time. The kitchen garden was expanding. The barn was in excellent repair. There were now 5 horses instead of 3, and the fence lines were all properly set and surveyed. Seth hired Tomás and Ernesto again for the harvest, and this time their families came out to the property on the last day of it for a supper that Sallie and Clara organized between them. A long evening in the October air with food and laughter, and the children running in the stubble fields in the last light. And Seth sat at the end of the table with William in his arms and Sallie beside him with her shoulder against his, and felt the evening settle around him like something permanent. Tomás, who was not a sentimental man but was an observant one, caught Seth's eye across the table and nodded once, a small, complete nod that Seth understood to mean, "You have done well." He nodded back. That winter, the second winter, was different from the first in the way that all second years of anything differ from the first, less sharply felt, less fragile, more deeply rooted. William had opinions about everything, and expressed them in a developing vocabulary that Sallie was teaching with the enthusiasm of someone who had grown up loving words. Seth built him a small rocking horse from oak that Jim Hutchins helped him finish, and William's face when he saw it on Christmas morning was the kind of thing Seth knew he would remember with perfect clarity until the last day of his life. Sallie gave Seth a new rifle that Christmas, a Winchester Model 1873, that she had ordered from San Felipe 3 months earlier, and which she presented with the directness that characterized everything she did, setting it across the table in front of him and saying, "The old one is getting loose at the stock." He looked at her, and then at the rifle, and then at her again. "Sallie, you need a proper rifle," she said, with a slight color in her face that suggested she was less casual about the gift than she was pretending to be. "You work this land. You need to be able to protect it." He picked it up and checked it with the easy familiarity of long experience, and it was excellent, perfectly balanced, exactly right. He set it back on the table and took her hands across it. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said, and the slight color in her face deepened, and then they both looked up because William had made his feelings about being ignored known from the floor where he was sitting. In the spring of 1880, Seth found a stray dog, part cattle dog, part something unknown and possibly questionable, on the north fence line, thin and wary, with a recently healed cut across his left shoulder. He brought the dog in, fed him, let him recover, and was fully prepared to rehome him with someone in town, but William, who was 9 months old and had recently developed the absolute conviction of personality, looked at the dog from his position on the blanket on the kitchen floor, and produced a sound of such determined desire that the question was settled. The dog was named Hector by Sallie, who said she would name the dog and no one could stop her, and Hector subsequently became the property's most committed security system, barn supervisor, and William's devoted shadow for the next decade. He slept outside the door of William's room, and Seth never once needed to ask him to. The letter from Sallie's cousin in Louisiana arrived in April of 1880, the first communication in over 2 years. Her name was Margaret, and she had written to say that she was recently married and wished to mend fences, figuratively speaking, with the family she had let grow distant. The letter was tentative and a little awkward, the way letters are when someone is reaching across a gap they helped create. Sallie showed it to Seth and asked what he thought. "What do you want?" he asked. "I think I want family," she said. "William is going to grow up knowing our neighbors and 2 hired men and a dog. It would be good for him to have more than that." "Then write back," Seth said. She did, and Margaret wrote back, and a cautious correspondence resumed. Margaret and her husband Albert visited in the fall of 1880, a polite and slightly stiff visit that gradually became warmer, and by the time they left 3 days later, Sallie and Margaret had found enough common ground to build on. The years began to compound in the way that good years do, not passing quickly in the sense of loss, but filling up, accumulating depth and detail and texture. In the spring of 1881, a late frost threatened the early crop, and Seth, and Sallie, and Jim Hutchins, and Tamaz worked for 2 days straight covering the young wheat with everything they had, and saved most of it. That summer, Sallie taught a reading class for the children of 2 of the Mexican families who worked properties in the area, meeting on Saturday mornings in the barn with slates borrowed from the church school, because she said a person's children deserved to read regardless of whose politics made that complicated, and anyone who objected could come and say so to her directly, which no one did. In the late autumn of 1881, Sallie told Seth she was pregnant again. This time she told him at breakfast, and he was more prepared in the sense of having gone through it before and less prepared in the sense that he was, if anything, more moved by it than the first time. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her and said, "Good." in a voice that was considerably more unsteady than he intended, and she laughed and reached across and took his hand. Their second child was born in June of 1882, a girl this time, born on a cooler evening than William had been, born quickly, and with the minimum of trouble, a solid and pink and apparently pleased infant who arrived with the air of someone who had planned the whole thing. They named her Anna for Sally's mother, Jane for no particular reason except that it suited her. William was almost 3 when Anna was born and took her arrival as a personal development of the highest order, arriving at her cradle each morning with the solemnity of someone checking on a very important project. Hector, who had been William's shadow for 3 years, transferred a portion of his loyalty to the cradle immediately and stationed himself beside it with the same conviction. Seth watched his family from the porch on a summer evening in 1882, the same porch from which Sallie had watched him ride in 4 years ago with a scrap of paper in his pocket, and no idea what he was riding toward. William was in the yard chasing something, a grasshopper probably, or possibly a butterfly, or possibly nothing at all because he was 2.5 and the world was endlessly interesting. Sallie was sitting in the chair beside Seth with Anna asleep in the crook of her arm, reading her book one-handed with the practiced ease of a woman who had learned to do everything one-handed, and the evening was that deep amber that late June produces in Texas, warm and long and full of the sounds of the place they had built. "Seth," Sallie said without looking up from her book, "stop looking at us like that." "Like what?" "Like you're afraid it's going to disappear." He was quiet for a moment. "Old habit," he said. She looked up then fully, meeting his eyes across the evening air, and her expression was the one he loved best on her, the one that was entirely clear and entirely present, without walls of any kind. "It's not going to disappear," she said. "This is real. This is ours." He reached out and covered her free hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she turned her palm up and held his hand back. Anna slept on between them, and William was still chasing whatever improbable thing had caught his attention in the yard, and the windmill was turning steady in the evening breeze, and the wheat fields beyond the fence were green and full and exactly as they should be. "I know," Seth said, and he did know, with a certainty that had grown deeper every year and showed no signs of doing anything but continuing. He had ridden into this place with nothing but a direction and a name, and the name had turned out to be the most important word he had ever read. He thought sometimes about the scrap of paper, which he still had. He kept it in the small wooden box on the washstand in their room, folded into quarters, the ink further blurred now from 4 years of handling but still legible. Sallie had found it once, early in the marriage, and picked it up and read it, and then looked at him with an expression between amusement and something more serious. "You kept it," she said. "It's where I was going," he said, "seemed worth keeping." She had folded it back carefully and put it back in the box, and that was the end of it, except that sometimes when he opened the box for the ring he kept there now, or for some small stored thing, he would see the paper and feel the specific echo of that long ride south. The flat plains opening out before him, the name burning in his pocket, the anticipation of something he couldn't name, and then he would feel the full distance between that man and this one, which was not a distance of miles but of depth. And he was glad beyond all expression for every step of it. The winter of 1882 brought the first real snow Seth had seen since Missouri, a 2-day event that shut the road to town and turned the whole property into something barely recognizable and absolutely beautiful. William stood at the window the first morning with his mouth open, having no prior framework for this, and then turned to his father with an expression of complete accusation, as though Seth had been withholding information. "What is it?" William demanded. "Snow," Seth said. "Snow," William repeated, tasting it. "Can he go out?" Sallie asked from the kitchen, in the tone of someone who already knew the answer was yes and was simply verifying. "He can go out," Seth said. They went out together, Seth and William, and Seth pulled him through the white-covered yard on a piece of board he had shaped into a makeshift sled, and William's laughter was the sound of pure, uncomplicated joy in a world that had briefly made itself strange and wonderful. Sallie watched from the porch with Anna in her arms and Hector pressed against her leg, and she was laughing too. And Seth looked back at her from across the yard, and she shook her head at him with an expression of such warm, helpless happiness that he felt it in his chest like a struck bell. That evening they ate supper by the fire and William fell asleep sitting up at the table, which was such a complete collapse that Seth simply carried him to bed still dressed and pulled the blanket over him, and the boy never stirred. Anna was already sleeping, and the house was quiet in the specific way that a house full of sleeping children is quiet, which is not empty but deeply occupied. Seth and Sallie sat together by the fire with cups of coffee and Sallie's book open in her lap, though she was not reading it, and the snow made the world outside the windows into something muffled and soft, and the fire cracked and settled. "I have something to tell you," Sallie said. He looked at her. Her expression had something contained about it, carefully held, the way she held things she was feeling very intensely until she was ready to let them out. "I'm expecting again," she said. He looked at her. He calculated quietly and felt a warmth spread through him. "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said, "I feel very well." A pause. "This will be 3. "It will," he said. "Is that—" She stopped. It was rare for her to stop like that, to not finish a sentence. It told him something. "Sallie," he said, 3 is exactly right." She looked at him for a long moment with the firelight on her face, and those gray eyes very direct and very bright. "You didn't expect any of this, did you?" she said. It was not quite a question. "No," he said. "I had a name on a piece of paper, and you rode 600 miles for it. I would have ridden more." She leaned against him then, settling into his side with the comfortable ease of a person who knows exactly where they belong, and he put his arm around her and felt her breath slow, and the fire settled lower, and the snow went on accumulating outside in the gentle and indiscriminate way of snow. Their 3rd child was born in August of 1883, another boy, whom they named James after Seth's older brother who had gone to California years ago and was still there, reportedly doing well, reportedly prospering, the kind of brother who existed mainly in infrequent letters but whose existence mattered nonetheless. James Maddox arrived red-faced and loudly opinionated, and immediately became William's devoted shadow in the same way William had become the dog's. By the time James was 2, the property had expanded. Seth and Jim Hutchins had gone together on the purchase of the adjacent western parcel when old Augustus Merritt, who had worked it alone since his wife died in 1879, decided to move back to his daughter in San Antonio. It was good land and the price was fair, and the acquisition doubled the grazing capacity of both properties, which meant cattle instead of just wheat, and the decision to run a small cattle herd on the new land was one of the best they made. Seth bought 6 heifers and 2 bulls from a man driving stock north from the Rio Grande, negotiated a fair price because he had driven enough cattle to know what fair was, and brought them home on a May afternoon in 1885 to an audience consisting of Sallie, William, who was almost 6 and trembling with excitement, Anna, who was 3 and more interested in the horses than the cattle, and James, who was 2 and objected to being held back from joining the cattle in the corral. "You'll have to teach William to work cattle," Sallie said that evening, watching her eldest son through the window. He was at the fence of the cattle corral, completely riveted. "He's been asking me since Tuesday," Seth said. "He's 5. I was on a cattle drive at 17. He has time." Seth paused. "But I can start teaching him the horses." William began learning the horses that summer, and the horses had the same patient certainty about him that animals seem to develop about children who approach them without fear. He was a good learner, attentive and serious in the way that he had inherited from his mother, and Seth taught him carefully, the way his own father had taught him carpentry, not by telling but by doing together and allowing the doing to become understanding. In 1886, William started school in Dusty Creek. Sallie had been teaching him at home with the same slates and the same shelf of books that lined the kitchen wall, and by the time he started school he could read competently, do sums with confidence, and had opinions about history that his teacher, a young woman named Miss Barclay who had come from back east with impressive credentials, and the kind of idealism that West Texas either destroys or refines, found somewhat overwhelming in a 6-year-old. Miss Barclay came to the property one afternoon that fall, which was an event that initially alarmed Seth and Sallie both, and then she explained herself. "William is advanced for his age," she said, sitting in the kitchen with the coffee Sallie had set before her. "He's reading at a level I'd expect from a 10-year-old. I wanted to know what you've been doing at home." Sallie said, "Books," and Miss Barclay said, "Well, yes." And then they had a conversation about education that lasted 2 hours, and which Seth followed with great interest from the other side of the kitchen table. And at the end of it, Sallie had agreed to help Miss Barclay organize a small lending library from the church, and Miss Barclay had agreed to accelerate William's reading work, and both women seemed very pleased with the outcome. Seth remarked later that Sallie had been essentially running an educational program for the children of the county for years and hadn't called it that. She said she had called it Tuesday mornings in the barn, and it was the same thing. He said he thought she should be proud of it. She said she was too busy to be proud of things. He said she should find time. She looked at him in the way she had developed over 8 years of marriage that conveyed enormous exasperated affection and said, "Seth Maddox, don't be insufferable," and he laughed and she tried not to. By the turn of the decade, 1890, 12 years after Seth had ridden in from the north with a scrap of paper and a buckskin mare, the property was something that bore little resemblance to what it had been and perfect resemblance to what it had always had the potential to become. The house had grown twice more, added onto with skill and intention, until it was a real house with 4 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a sitting room with Sallie's books along an entire wall. The fields produced 2 crops now, wheat and sorghum on alternating years, managed with the accumulated knowledge of 12 growing seasons and the steady improvement of technique and tools. The cattle herd had grown to 40 head, run on the expanded property with the help of a young hand named Clem who had shown up one spring looking for work with the specific determined look of a boy from somewhere else who had decided West Texas was where he was meant to be. Seth had recognized the look and hired him. William was 11 and already taller than many men. Learning cattle work in the earnest, methodical way he learned everything, helping with the roundup in the fall with a seriousness that made the neighboring men smile. Anna was 9 and had her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubbornness, and was at present deep in a correspondence with Margaret's daughter in Louisiana that produced letters of remarkable length and detail for a 9-year-old. James was 7 and had apparently decided that he was personally responsible for every mechanical thing on the property, following Seth around with tools and asking questions about every fastening and fitting, until Seth began to suspect that James would not be a farmer but might become the finest mechanic the county had ever produced. There was also, since the spring of that year, a daughter named Clara Rose, named partly for Clara Hutchins, who was her godmother and who had received the news with the same full-force enthusiasm she brought to every development in Sallie's life, who was 4 months old and had her father's blue eyes and her mother's red hair, and the general air of someone who intended to run things as soon as she was large enough to do so. Sallie was 35. Seth was 38. Clara was sleeping in the cradle beside the bed, and it was a September evening in 1890, and they were sitting on the porch that was now twice the size of the original, looking out at the property in the long light. The windmill was turning. It was a different windmill. Seth had replaced the original in 1885 with a better one, properly fitted, and it had not given a moment of trouble since. The wheat was cut and the fields were resting. The cattle were in the far pasture, a presence felt more than seen in the falling light. Hector was, impossibly, still alive at 12 years old, moving slowly now and mostly sleeping, but still stationed each evening by whoever's presence he felt was most in need of supervision. Tonight it was Sallie's. William was inside at the table with a book. Anna had been sent to bed an hour ago and was almost certainly reading under her covers by lantern light, which was a habit she had developed from her mother. James had fallen asleep in the barn, which happened occasionally, and Seth had carried him in already. Clara was sleeping. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" Sallie said. "Tell me." "I was thinking about that first morning," she said, "when you came up the path with your horse. And I was standing on the porch trying to decide what I thought of you." "What did you think of me?" he asked. It was an old conversation, one they had visited a few times over the years, and it always produced something new. "Honestly." She smiled, and after 12 years her smile still did what it had always done to the interior of his chest. "I thought you looked like a man who had been riding a long time and had gotten into the habit of looking at the horizon." "That's accurate," he said. I thought if he's been looking at the horizon that long he might have trouble settling," she said. "I thought it might not work." "Did you almost not let me stay?" "No," she said. "I was too practical for that. I needed the windmill fixed." A pause, and there was something she stopped, considering. "You looked at the fields before you looked at the house. I noticed that. You looked at the wheat and you said it was coming in well. And I thought, whoever you are, you look at land the way someone looks at something they respect." "I do respect it," Seth said. "I know you do." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I knew you did then, I just didn't know I could trust it yet." "You gave me enough time to earn it," he said. "I did," she agreed. "I think that was the right call." He kissed the top of her head. The evening was cooling now, the last light going, the first stars appearing over the western edge of the sky in the slow accumulation that always made the Texas sky feel more enormous than it had been a moment ago. "Seth," Sallie said, "are you glad you answered that advertisement?" It was a question she had never asked him in those exact words, and it struck him as interesting that she would ask it now, 12 years in, with 4 children sleeping inside and 40 years of well-run land around them, and 12 years of being known, properly, entirely, without concealment, by another person. "Sallie," he said, "I have been glad of exactly one decision in my life with the totality of every part of me, and it's the decision I made standing in a general store in Abilene in 1878, reading an advertisement about a capable woman in Dusty Creek, Texas." She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her breathing slow the way it did when she was sitting with something. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to hear it properly." "All right." She lifted her head and turned to look at him in the fading light, and her face was the face he knew better than any other face on earth. Every line of it, every expression, every shade of what went on behind those gray eyes, and she was, still, more beautiful to him than anything. "You were not what I expected," she said. "I had written an advertisement for a practical arrangement with a man of steady character who would work the land. I was not expecting—" She stopped, and he saw her swallow. "I was not expecting someone who would see me, all of me, and stay." "I always stay," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm telling you, I know." He took her hand and held it, and she leaned back against his shoulder, and they sat together in the cooling September evening, while the stars came out over Texas, and the house behind them held their sleeping children and everything they had built, and the scrap of paper in the wooden box in the bedroom had long since been made into something so much larger than itself that it was almost impossible to trace the line from it to here, except that the line was there, clear and certain. A single thread running from a name written in faded ink through 600 miles of open country to this porch. This woman, this life. Seth had come with one direction and one name, and the name had led him to the only place he had ever completely belonged, and the only person he had ever loved without reservation or remainder, and the only life that had ever felt in every inch of it, in every hard winter and good harvest and long evening and ordinary morning and extraordinary ordinary day, entirely, irrevocably, finally his own. The windmill turned in the dark. Inside the house, William turned a page. The stars continued their slow, enormous crossing of the Texas sky. Somewhere in the far pasture, one of the cattle called once and then was silent. Hector got up from his place by the door, turned in a circle and lay back down. The evening settled around them like a hand laid gently on the world, and Seth Maddox held his wife's hand on the porch of the home they had built, and was, for the first time and the thousandth time, and every time in between completely, wholly home.